I thanked my lawyer for winning my inheritance, and he frowned like I'd just told him a story that didn't make sense. Then he said slowly, "Margaret, what inheritance?" And in that second, the room felt too quiet, too still, like the air had been pulled out of it and replaced with something colder, heavier, something that made it hard to breathe, because for the past 6 months, I had been living my life believing everything was already taken care of, that after my husband Robert passed, after 43 years of marriage, all the paperwork had been handled, all the details settled, all the promises he made to me quietly honored behind the scenes. That's what my daughter-in-law Sophia told me over and over again, in that soft, reassuring voice she used whenever she wanted me to stop asking questions. "Don't worry, Mom. It's all being handled," she would say, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder like she was doing me a favor, like she was protecting me from something too complicated for me to understand. And I believed her, not because I'm naive, but because I was tired of hospitals, tired of paperwork, tired of sitting in a house that suddenly felt twice as big and completely empty at the same time. So I let her take over. I let my son Daniel nod along beside her, quiet, distant, avoiding my eyes in a way I didn't want to notice, and I told myself this was what family did. We helped each other. We stepped in when someone else couldn't carry the weight anymore. But, standing there in that office, looking at Mr. Collins as he shuffled through his files, clearly confused, clearly certain that no such case had ever passed through his hands, I felt something shift inside me, not a sharp pain, not anger, just a slow, creeping realization that didn't need to shout to be heard. I had never signed anything, not a single document, not a single page, not even one of those thick envelopes lawyers always send. I hadn't seen Robert's final will with my own eyes. I hadn't sat in a room where someone read it aloud. I hadn't even been asked to confirm my identity or my address. All the things that should have happened simply hadn't, and yet I had accepted it, day after day, week after week, because Sophia kept smiling, because Daniel kept saying, "It's under control, Mom." And I wanted to believe that meant something. I needed it to mean something. But now, as the silence stretched between me and the only man who could tell me the truth, I realized I had been living inside a story someone else wrote for me. A story where everything was fine, everything was settled, everything was exactly as it should be, except it wasn't. And for the first time since Robert was gone, I heard my own voice cut through the quiet, steady, calm, almost detached as I asked the question that should have been obvious from the beginning. "Then who signed on my behalf?" I did not expect an answer right away, but the way Mr. Collins hesitated told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke again, because he did not look defensive or cautious. He looked genuinely puzzled, like a man trying to recall a conversation that had never happened. And then he slowly closed the folder in front of him and said my name carefully, as if he needed to ground the moment in something real. "Margaret, I have handled your husband's legal affairs for over a decade, and I can assure you there has been no finalized inheritance case filed under your name, not in the past year, not before that either." In the calm way he said it made it worse, not better, because there was no accusation in his voice, no hint that something had gone wrong on his end, just a quiet certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. And I felt my hands resting on my lap, still and composed, but suddenly unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone who had been sitting there much longer than I realized. I nodded once as if I understood, but inside my thoughts began rearranging themselves quickly, pieces that never quite fit before now shifting into place with a clarity that was almost unsettling. I remembered the afternoon Sophia first mentioned the paperwork. She had been standing in my kitchen sunlight, catching the edge of her hair as she smiled, and said Robert made everything very clear before he passed. "You do not need to worry about a thing." And I remember how Daniel stood behind her, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, not looking at me, but not disagreeing either. And I took that silence as reassurance, because that is what a mother does. She fills in the gaps with trust, even when something feels slightly off, even when a question rises quietly and then disappears just as quickly, because it is easier to believe than to doubt. But now, sitting in that office, I could see those moments differently, the way Sophia never showed me a single document, the way every time I asked about timelines, she would gently redirect the conversation towards something else: my health, the house, the weather, anything that sounded reasonable enough to make me forget what I had asked. And I let her do it, because grief has a way of softening your edges. It makes you less likely to push, less likely to insist. and more willing to accept what you are given, especially when it comes wrapped in kindness. Mr. Collins cleared his throat softly and reached for a pen, tapping it once against the desk as if organizing his thoughts. Margaret, the only recent activity related to your husband's estate was a request for information about asset distribution, but it was not submitted by you. He paused just long enough for the words to settle before continuing. It was submitted under your family name, but not with your authorization, and I felt something steady inside me, not panic, not fear, just a quiet understanding that whatever had been done had not been an accident, and for the first time I did not feel the urge to ask why. Instead, I asked something simpler, something that did not require emotion, only clarity. Who submitted it? And Mr. Collins looked at me carefully, now studying my face, as if deciding how much to say before answering. The name listed on the request was Daniel Whitmore, and just like that, the last piece settled into place, not with a crash, but with a soft finality that was almost worse because it meant there was no misunderstanding left to hold on to. No explanation that could smooth it over, no version of this where I had simply been mistaken. And I sat there in silence for a moment longer, not because I did not know what to say, but because I realized I did not need to say anything at all. The truth had already been spoken, and it did not need to be louder than that. I did not react the way they probably expected me to, not that they knew I had already spoken to Mr. Collins, not that they had any reason to suspect the quiet shift that had taken place inside me. Because when I walked back into my house that afternoon, everything looked exactly the same polished wooden floors, the same framed photographs lining the hallway, the same faint scent of lavender that Sophia insisted on using in every room, as if she had slowly been replacing every trace of me with something softer, more controlled, more hers. And I stood there for a moment longer than usual, keys still in my hand, listening to the silence, not empty, but waiting, as if the house itself had been holding on to something I had refused to see. And then I set my purse down carefully on the small table by the door, the same place I had set it every day for years, and I realized that habits can be dangerous. They make everything feel normal, even when nothing is. And later that evening, when Daniel and Sophia came home, I greeted them the same way I always did, calm, polite, steady. My voice did not tremble, my expression did not change, because there was nothing left in me that needed to react. Not yet. Sophia smiled as she walked in, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and she leaned in to kiss my cheek, a gesture that had always felt slightly rehearsed, but now felt almost calculated. And she asked about my day in that warm, practiced tone, and I answered just as simply. I said it was quiet, uneventful, which was not a lie, just not the whole truth. And Daniel followed behind her, loosening his tie, glancing briefly in my direction before looking away again. That same small avoidance I had ignored before, now standing out with a clarity that was impossible to miss. And as we sat down for dinner, the three of us at a table that suddenly felt too structured, too deliberate, I watched them more closely than I ever had, not searching for proof, but observing patterns. The way Sophia spoke first, filling the silence before anyone else could. The way Daniel agreed quickly, rarely adding anything of his own. The way certain topics were never mentioned, not Robert, not the will, not anything that required specifics. And I realized that this was not new. This had been happening for months. I had just chosen not to see it, because seeing it would have meant questioning them, and questioning them would have meant admitting that something was wrong. And that was a step I had not been ready to take until now. And at one point during dinner, Sophia reached for her glass of water and said casually, "We should probably finish organizing the remaining documents soon. There are still a few things to finalize." And she said it so naturally, so effortlessly, that it might have sounded harmless to anyone else. But I felt the weight of those words settle in the space between us, because there were no remaining documents. There had never been any for me. And Daniel nodded again, without looking at me. And that was when I understood something important. This was not a single decision. This was a series of choices made quietly, consistently over time, choices to exclude, to redirect, to control information until there was nothing left for me to question. And I placed my fork down gently and looked at them both, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar. And I asked in the same steady voice I had used all evening, "What documents are you talking about?" And for the first time since they walked through that door, Sophia paused just for a second, barely noticeable, but enough. And Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his hand tightening around his glass. And in that small, fragile silence, I saw it clearly, not guilt, not fear, but the recognition that something had changed, that I was no longer asking out of habit or confusion, but because I already knew there was something they had not told me. and I was finally ready to hear it. Sophia recovered quickly, faster than most people would have, because she had always been good at adjusting her tone, her posture, her entire presence to fit whatever moment she needed, and she gave a small, composed smile as if my question had been nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. "Oh, just some remaining paperwork," she said lightly, "things that still need to be organized for the estate, nothing major," and she reached for her glass again, as if that explanation should be enough, as if it should close the conversation neatly and move us forward. But I did not pick up my fork again. I did not look away. I simply watched her, and then I shifted my gaze to Daniel, who still had not met my eyes, and I noticed something I had ignored before: the way his shoulders tensed slightly whenever I spoke directly to him, the way his answers were always delayed by just a second, as if he needed time to decide which version of the truth to give. And I realized that silence is not always absence, sometimes it is a choice. And tonight his silence was louder than anything Sophia could say. I let a few seconds pass, long enough for the air to grow slightly uncomfortable, but not enough to feel confrontational. And then I spoke again, calmly, precisely. "What paperwork, Daniel?" This time he could not avoid it. He glanced up briefly, then back down at his plate, his fingers tightening around his fork before he set it down and cleared his throat. "It is just standard things, Mom. Nothing you need to worry about. We are handling it." And there it was again, that same phrase that had been repeated so many times it had almost become a script, something practiced, something safe, something designed to end the conversation before it could begin. But it did not have the same effect anymore, because now I knew what was behind it, or rather what was not behind it, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, not in defeat, but in observation, because I was no longer part of the version of events they were trying to maintain. I was watching it from the outside, now seeing the small adjustments, the careful wording, the way Sophia immediately stepped back in to fill the space Daniel had left uncertain. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, a gesture that looked supportive but felt controlling. "If you remember, Margaret," she said gently, "Robert wanted things to be simple. He trusted us to take care of everything for you." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was comforting, but because it was familiar. That appeal to Robert's wishes, the subtle shift that made it seem like questioning them was the same as questioning him, and for a long time that had been enough to keep me quiet. But now it sounded different. Now it sounded like a strategy, and I nodded slowly, as if I were considering her words carefully, even though my mind had already moved past them. "Robert trusted me too," I said softly, and this time both of them looked at me, not surprised, not defensive, but alert, as if they were trying to understand what direction this conversation was taking. And I let that moment sit between us before continuing, because I did not need to rush anymore. I did not need to push. I only needed to observe and ask the right questions at the right time. "So tell me," I said, looking directly at Daniel, "when exactly was the will finalized?" And the way his expression faltered just for a fraction of a second told me more than any answer could have, because people can prepare for questions they expect, but they rarely prepare for the ones that require specific details. And for the first time since this conversation began, neither of them spoke immediately. Sophia's hand remained on Daniel's arm, but her fingers tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, and Daniel inhaled, as if he were about to say something, then stopped. And in that small pause, that fragile, unguarded space, I saw it clearly. This was not confusion. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was something constructed, something maintained carefully over time. And now, for the first time, it was beginning to crack, not because I had raised my voice, not because I had accused them of anything, but because I had stopped accepting answers that did not contain truth. Daniel did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than any words could have, because it was no longer just hesitation, it was calculation. And I watched him carefully as he finally lifted his eyes toward me, not fully meeting my gaze, but close enough to show that he understood the question was not going away. "It was finalized a few months ago," he said quietly, his voice controlled but lacking the certainty it once had. And I tilted my head slightly, as if considering his answer, even though I already knew it did not align with what I had been told earlier that day. "A few months ago," I repeated softly, letting the words settle between us. And Sophia shifted in her chair, just enough to draw attention back to herself. She smiled again, that same composed expression, but now there was a faint tightness around her eyes, as if she were holding something in place. "Margaret, these things take time," she said gently. "There are processes, reviews, legal steps. You know how complicated these matters can be." And I almost nodded, because that explanation would have worked before it would have been enough to quiet any lingering doubt. but now it sounded rehearsed, too smooth, too convenient. And I leaned forward, just slightly, not aggressively, not confrontational, but with a quiet focus that made it clear I was listening differently. Now I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just more precise. Which attorney handled the final documents? And for the first time, Sophia did not answer immediately. She glanced at Daniel quickly, a small look that might have gone unnoticed before, but now felt significant because it was not a look for agreement. It was a look for confirmation, as if they needed to make sure they were still telling the same version of the story. And Daniel cleared his throat again. "Mr. Collins," he said finally. And that was when I knew the truth had already slipped through their hands, because I did not correct him, I did not challenge him, I simply let the name sit there between us, heavy and undeniable. And Sophia's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table before she relaxed them again, smoothing her expression back into something calm, something presentable, and I leaned back once more, folding my hands together in my lap, as if the conversation had returned to something ordinary, even though it had not. "You see," I said softly, "I spoke with Mr. Collins today," and the way the room shifted then was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, because Daniel's shoulders stiffened and Sophia's smile did not disappear, but it stopped reaching her eyes, and I continued, not rushing, not pressing, just placing each word exactly where it needed to be. He seemed confused when I mentioned the inheritance. I paused briefly, just enough to let them feel the weight of that statement before adding, "He said there was no case filed under my name," and this time neither of them spoke at all. The silence that followed was no longer comfortable, no longer something that could be filled with polite conversation or gentle reassurances. It was a silence that demanded acknowledgement, and I did not break it. I simply watched them, not as a mother waiting for an explanation, but as someone observing a situation that had already revealed itself. And after a few seconds, Sophia inhaled slowly, as if preparing to respond. Her voice, when it came, was still calm, still measured, but there was something different beneath it, something more careful. "Margaret, there must be some misunderstanding," she said. "Perhaps he was referring to a different stage of the process, or maybe the documents were filed under a different category." And I almost admired the way she adjusted so quickly, the way she created space for doubt, even when the truth had already been spoken. But I shook my head gently, not in disagreement, but in quiet certainty. "He also told me who submitted the request," I said, and this time I looked directly at Daniel, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that did not need to be explained. And his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me, because I had known him his entire life, and I could see the exact moment he realized that whatever they had constructed, whatever version of events they had carefully maintained, was no longer holding together the way it once had. And I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to accuse, because the truth was already sitting there between us, waiting for one of them to acknowledge it. And for the first time, neither of them seemed entirely sure how to do that. Daniel finally exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for longer than he realized. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not defensive, not even argumentative, just "Careful, Mom, it is not what you think," he said. And I noticed how he chose those words, not a denial, not a correction, just a vague attempt to reshape something that had already taken form in front of all of us. And I did not interrupt him, I did not rush to respond, because I wanted to hear exactly how far he was willing to go with that sentence. But before he could continue, Sophia stepped in again, her tone still composed, but now more deliberate, as if each word had been measured before it was spoken. "Margaret, there were decisions that needed to be made quickly," she said, "and we did what we thought was best for everyone." And I let that sit there for a moment, because the phrase "what we thought was best" carried more weight than she probably intended. It was not about confusion, it was not about paperwork, it was about choice and authority. And I tilted my head slightly, studying her expression, the way she held her posture straight, the way her voice remained steady even now. And I realized something important. She did not see this as a mistake, she saw it as something justified, something necessary. And that understanding settled over me with a strange kind of clarity. I nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging her explanation, even though I had not accepted it. "Best for everyone," I repeated softly, and then I looked at Daniel again, not asking, but observing, because this was the part where he had to decide whether to stand behind those words or step away from them. And for a moment, he said nothing, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again. And when he spoke, there was something different in his tone, not stronger, not more confident, just more exposed. "We did not want you to worry, Mom," he said. "We knew how much you were already dealing with after Dad." And we thought it would be easier if we handled everything ourselves, and there it was the reasoning that had probably sounded logical when they first convinced themselves of it, the kind of explanation that replaces honesty with convenience and calls it protection. And I did not argue with him because I understood the surface of that statement. I understood the instinct to shield someone from stress, from complexity, from difficult conversations, but this was not that. This was not protection, this was removal, and I let my hands rest calmly in my lap as I spoke again, still quiet, still measured, easier for who I asked, and that question lingered in the air longer than any accusation could have, because it did not challenge them directly, it simply forced them to consider the direction of their own reasoning. And Sophia inhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting just slightly before settling again, as if she were recalibrating. "Margaret, you have always trusted us," she said, and I almost smiled again, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because that was the foundation everything had been built on, not documents, not signatures, not legal authority, but trust, something invisible, something easy to overlook until it is the only thing left holding everything together. And I leaned forward just a fraction, enough to show that I was still engaged, still present, still listening, but no longer passive. "Trust does not replace consent," I said softly, and for the first time her composure faltered, just slightly, not enough to break, but enough to reveal the effort behind it. And Daniel shifted in his seat again, his hand moving to rest on the table as if he needed something solid to ground himself. And I could see it now more clearly than before. This was no longer about explaining what had happened. It was about confronting what it meant. And I did not raise my voice. I did not press them further, because I did not need to. The truth had already moved beyond denial. It was no longer hidden behind confusion or vague reassurances. It was standing there quietly, undeniable. And I sat back again, letting the silence return, not as an absence, but as a presence, something that filled the space between us with a weight that could not be dismissed. And in that silence, I understood something that had taken me far too long to see. This was never about paperwork. This was about control. And now that I could see it, I knew exactly what I needed to do next, even if they did not realize it yet. That night, I did not say anything more, and neither did they, because there was nothing left that needed to be forced into words. And when I stood up from the table, I did it the same way I always had, calm, steady, without drawing attention to the shift that had already taken place inside me. And I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it carefully, placed it in the dishwasher, as if routine itself could hold everything together just a little longer. And then I excused myself early, not because I was tired, but because I needed space, not from them, but from the version of myself that had accepted everything without question for far too long. And when I closed the door to my bedroom, the quiet felt different, not heavy, not suffocating, but clear, like the kind of silence that allows you to finally hear your own thoughts without interruption. And I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking around the room that had once belonged to Robert and me, the photographs, the small details, the life we had built piece by piece over decades. And I realized that for all the things that had been taken from me without my knowledge, there were still things that had never been theirs to touch. And I reached for the small wooden box in the drawer of my nightstand, the one Robert had given me years ago, not on a special occasion, not tied to any celebration, just something he handed me one quiet afternoon with a simple instruction: "Keep this safe, Margaret, you will know when it matters." And at the time I had smiled, thinking it was just another one of his careful habits, his way of organizing the world around him. But now, as I opened the box and saw the contents inside, neatly arranged, untouched, exactly as he had left them, I understood that he had not been organizing anything, he had been preparing. And I lifted the envelope, slowly feeling its weight, not heavy, but certain, the kind of weight that does not need to be explained to be understood. And I did not open it right away. I did not rush, because for the first time since all of this began, I was not reacting, I was choosing. And that difference mattered more than anything else, because everything they had done had relied on my silence, my trust, my willingness to step back and let them take control. But this was different. This was something they did not know about, something they could not anticipate. And I set the envelope back into the box, carefully closing it again, not hiding it, but preserving the moment, because I knew exactly what it represented, not just answers, but leverage. And I stood up, slowly walking toward the window, looking out into the darkened street where everything appeared quiet, unchanged, as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted at all. And I realized that was exactly how they had managed to do it. They had relied on appearances, on the idea that if everything looked normal, then no one would question it, especially not me. But that assumption no longer held any power, because I was no longer looking at what was visible, I was paying attention to what was missing. And when I finally stepped away from the window, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity, and it was sharper than anything I had felt before, because it did not ask for reaction, it demanded direction, and I knew what that direction would be, not tomorrow, not in some distant moment, but soon, because timing was the only thing that still needed to be chosen carefully. And as I turned off the light and laid down in the quiet of the room that no longer felt quite the same, I allowed myself one final thought before closing my eyes. They believed they had already finished this. They believed everything had been decided without me. But what they did not understand was that the story they thought was over had only just begun to shift in a way they would never see coming. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already settled into something steady, something focused. And when I walked into the kitchen, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel comforting but now felt revealing, because without voices, without movement, there was nothing to distract from the details I had overlooked for so long. And I moved slowly through my routine, making coffee, measuring each step the same way I always had, but this time I paid attention to everything: the placement of documents on the counter, the small stack of unopened mail, the way Sophia had organized the drawers in a way that made everything look efficient but unfamiliar. And I realized that control does not always appear as force. Sometimes it looks like order, sometimes it looks like someone quietly rearranging your life until it no longer belongs entirely to you. And I poured my coffee into the same cup I had used for years and sat down at the table, not with urgency, but with intention, because I was no longer reacting, I was preparing. And after a few minutes, I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where we kept older files, things that were no longer in daily use, but had never been thrown away. And I opened the door, carefully scanning the shelves until I found the box I was looking for, the one labeled simply with Robert's handwriting, "Personal Records," and I lifted it down slowly, placing it on the table in front of me. And for a moment, I just looked at it, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this was something he had left behind, not just documents, but a record of how things were meant to be handled before anyone else had the chance to reinterpret them. And I opened the box methodically, going through each folder one by one, not searching blindly, but following a pattern the way he would have expected me to. Because Robert never left things unfinished, he anticipated questions, he anticipated complications, and he always believed that clarity was something you created in advance, not something you waited for. And it did not take long before I found what I needed: not a single document, but a series of them, carefully organized copies of statements, notes in his handwriting, dates, references to accounts, and instructions that had never been mentioned to me by anyone else. And as I read through them slowly, I felt that same quiet certainty return, not as a sudden realization, but as a confirmation that what I had begun to understand the night before was not only true, it had been expected by him in some way. And I sat back in my chair, holding one particular document longer than the others, because it contained something specific, something that explained why the version of events I had been given never quite aligned with what should have happened. And I set it aside, carefully, not separating it from the others, but marking it as important. And then I closed the box, not because I was finished, but because I had enough for now, enough to move forward without guessing. And when I heard footsteps upstairs a few minutes later, I did not rush to put anything away. I simply left the box where it was and returned to my coffee as if nothing had changed, because outwardly nothing had, but internally everything had shifted into place. And when Sophia walked into the kitchen a short while later, she greeted me the same way she always did, her voice light, her expression composed. But I noticed the brief flicker of her eyes toward the table, toward the box, and then back to me. And in that small glance, I saw a recognition, not of what was inside, but of what it meant that I had opened it. And she smiled again, asking casually if I needed help with anything, and I returned the smile, just as calmly. "No, thank you," I said. "I think I can manage." And for the first time, those words were not a reassurance, they were a statement. And I could tell by the way she held my gaze for just a moment longer than usual that she understood that something had changed, even if she did not yet know exactly what. And I did not explain, I did not offer details, because this was not a moment for confrontation, this was a moment for positioning. And as I finished my coffee and stood up from the table, I carried that understanding with me, not as a burden, but as something precise, something measured, something that would unfold exactly when it needed to, and not a moment sooner. By the afternoon, everything appeared exactly the same from the outside, the house, quiet, the routines, unchanged, the conversations light and measured, but underneath that surface there was a precision, now a direction that had not existed before, and I moved through the day without interruption, not avoiding them, not confronting them, simply allowing time to do what it always does, reveal what people think is already settled. And later that evening, when we sat down again at the same table, the same positions, the same quiet patterns, I noticed how carefully they watched me, now not openly, not with suspicion, but with an awareness that had not been there before, as if they could sense that something had shifted, even if they could not yet define it. And I let that awareness remain unchallenged. I did not rush to fill the silence. I did not return to the questions from the night before, because this was no longer about asking. It was about choosing the moment when answers would no longer be optional. And halfway through dinner, I set my fork down, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but just enough to change the rhythm of the room, and both of them looked up almost instinctively, and I reached for the folder I had placed beside my chair earlier, not hidden, not displayed, simply present, and I opened it slowly, placing a single document on the table between us, not pushing it forward, not explaining it, just allowing it to exist there where it could not be ignored. And for a moment neither of them moved. Sophia's eyes shifted to the page, first scanning quickly before returning to my face, her expression still controlled, but tighter, now more focused. And Daniel followed more slowly, his gaze lingering longer on the document, as if trying to understand not just what it was, but what it meant that I had it. And I spoke, then quietly, not to accuse, not to explain, but to state something that no longer required interpretation. Robert prepared for this, I said, and the words settled into the space with a weight that was not emotional, but factual. And Sophia leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her voice, when she spoke, still even, but more deliberate. Margaret, I am not sure what you think this proves, she said, and I met her gaze calmly, because I had expected that response, not denial, not anger, but an attempt to redefine the situation before it could fully take shape. And I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them. It proves that there were instructions, I said, and more importantly, it proves that those instructions were not followed. And this time Daniel shifted more noticeably, his hand moving across the table, as if to reach for the document before stopping midway, and I watched that hesitation carefully, because it told me more than any explanation could. And I continued, not pressing but guiding the moment forward. There is a second account, I said, one that was never mentioned, not to me and not to Mr. Collins. And for the first time Sophia's composure faltered in a way that could not be disguised, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention in any other setting. But here in this quiet, controlled space, it was unmistakable, a brief tightening of her expression, a pause that lasted just long enough to reveal that this was not part of the version of events she had prepared for. And I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to explain further, because the meaning was already clear. They had taken what they believed was everything, they had organized, controlled, redirected, until there was nothing left for me to question, but they had done it without knowing that something had been left outside their reach, not by accident, but by design. And I closed the folder gently, not ending the conversation, but defining it. And I looked at them both, not as a mother seeking answers, but as someone who had already found them and understood exactly what they meant. I trusted you, I said quietly, and the words were not filled with accusation or pain, they were simply true. And then I added, just as calmly, and now I understand why that mattered more than anything else. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was complete, because for the first time there was nothing left for them to control. And as I sat there watching them, I realized something that brought a quiet finality to everything that had happened. They believed they had taken my place in the decisions that shaped this family. But what they did not understand was that control without understanding is never complete. And now that I understood everything, the balance had already begun to shift in a way they could not undo.